Hello there. So I want to do something a bit different today. So far, I've been talking a lot about primitive psychology and cave art, and I've also started opening the doors to certain current events that are going on today. And I think that I've released enough of a range of material by now to achieve something like I want to do today. And what I want to talk about is this very interesting yet very tragic event that happened in America this month. The case of a young artist called Randy Stair. The brief outline of the case is that this was a young trans man, a transgender man, who was also an artist, and he had been experiencing extreme depression for many years of his life, and out of this turmoil was produced a female alter identity that he used originally to offer him some respite from his suffering, but he very quickly became obsessed with her to the point where this created figure perturbed his ability to be able to read reality correctly. And this individual had a YouTube channel where he produced animations of this creative character and other video productions. And all of this culminated in a tragic event at the grocery store where he worked. And he shot up three of his co-workers in the name of this companion, before finally turning the gun on himself and taking his own life, after which he believed that he would be reunited with this sacred feminine creation and exist in a state of eternal bliss with her in what was called a ghost squad, a kind of afterlife for victims of suicide and other violent acts. And he very much saw himself as a victim, even though he created more victims through his regressions, but we'll get onto that a bit later. And the reason why I find this case so interesting to talk about is because when I first heard about it, certain features, shall we say, really stood out to me, especially surrounding the fact that this killer was an artist, and through listening to him, certain features of his story resonated with certain aspects of Jungian psychoanalysis that I know about. And since this is very much a channel that uses lenses like psychoanalysis and mythology and other subjects to elucidate certain aspects of the creative life and the creative culture, I thought it would be really interesting to apply that mode of analysis onto this case, because we rarely hear about Jungian thought being applied to cases like this, where there's an abundance of material for it to be. And let's just make one thing clear. I am not a Jungian psychoanalyst. I am not an expert in this by any means. I am first and foremost an artist that has self-educated and used certain systems like Jungian psychoanalysis to not only elucidate certain aspects of my creative world, but also it's helped me a lot personally to reconcile with certain features of my own psychological life. And so I know enough, both through personal research and from experience, about using creativity and psychological lenses to migrate out of a dark period, a dark patch. And this is a process that Randy Stair greatly failed in. He became consumed by his own darkness. And so I hope that this is not only an interesting case study, but I want us to be able to take something more important away than that, something that we can use to heal ourselves and learn more about them ourselves, and not run the risk of entering down the same path that Randy Stair did, because this kind of thing is extremely important to talk about. And if you think about it, this is another example of what makes the time that we live in so unique, because we can gain so much insight into the lives of people through the traces that they leave behind, compared to before, where if something like this happened in the 90s, say, police would probably raid a house and find some diaries or a scrapbook that we would probably never see. Whereas today, that's completely different. The psychological record of mankind is being transcribed electronically at incomprehensible rates every single hour and every single day. So it makes for really interesting research when we discover cases like this. And I do think that it's an interesting case for a number of reasons particular to this channel. He was a creative individual, a very creative individual, and usually in circumstances like this we don't get a deeper account rendered to us by the authorities. And so I wanted to make this because I think that it speaks very strongly to certain things that would be interesting to people who have an interest in human nature and the psychological power of creative imagery especially. Now, I want to clarify something before we go ahead with this. I have never shared the fascination with murderers and serial killers that some people seem to possess. I think that it's misguided intrigue, because when people find themselves being interested in these kind of things, I think that it's obviously an indication of a very inquisitive mind that wants to understand the human world through its darker aspects. But I also think that the unconscious motivation with a lot of people isn't merely knowledge in a genuine sense, a genuine desire to comprehend the human world through its darker aspects. I think that what's actually propelling it forward is a morbid fascination with the ugliness of extreme acts, and I really do not like the glamorizing of those personalities that executed them. I don't admire these people at all. Charles Manson, Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez. I bloody hate Richard Ramirez. So I understand why people would be interested in them. I just don't think that a lot of people are interested in them for the right reasons. And so I think that it's often a sign of a very perverse mind, because it's not an interest based on a genuine inquisition to seek clarity. I think that it's done out of a vulgar pleasure, to be honest, and I do not want this analysis to be confused with that. This is probably going to be quite a long video, but it's going to be a bloody important video, so I hope you stay through it and you listen to it properly. If you're only interested in this, if you're only mildly interested in this, then either concentrate now or go on to another thing, because this is highly, highly important stuff about the human condition and the condition of our society. And I don't think that this kind of thing gets treated often with the seriousness and the thoroughness that it rightly deserves. And as a result of that lack of depth, these incidents continue to destroy people's lives, and as long as we continue to not take it seriously enough and simply brush these people off as being monsters and, ignore it, then these events will continue to perpetuate, because the fundamental substructures that are enabling them are left unattended. I'll be throwing up the occasional video clip from the uploads that Randy Stair left behind as well, just to highlight certain features of his mentality throughout. So, yeah, with all that being said, here we go. So what I'm going to do with this exposition is talk about certain aspects of Randy's backstory and the events that led up to the murders, and then compare that to the record that we have from Jungian material. As I said, this is going to get very deep and it's going to get quite dark, but by the end of it, I hope that we can all take away something instructive for ourselves. So let's just dive right into it. So this individual, Randy Stair, let's talk a bit about what he's told us about his background. Stair came from an American middle-class background, very much provided for in every way, didn't have to go without in terms of material resources. However, it's quite apparent that human beings require much more than a roof over their heads and sustenance to keep them going. They require a great deal of emotional investment. And it's quite apparent to me that Stair was probably a highly sensitive, very sensitive individual, and a very intuitive young man. He described difficulties in being able to relate to other human beings from a very young age. He was naturally drawn towards seclusion and introspection as a result of that. I'm not sure whether he was anywhere on an Asperger's spectrum or anything like that. If he was obviously a very high functioning one in those respects, and he didn't mention anything like a diagnosis in that in any of the videos that I've seen of him. So I'm just saying it's a potentiality that we have to take into consideration here. Anyway, his relationship with his family seems to be quite divided. He speaks quite affectionately about his grandparents, but that's not really extended towards his immediate mother and father. He said that out of the two, he could connect more with his mother, far more than his father, but it seems that his isolationism extended to them as well. He recalled a story about Thanksgiving one year where all of the family were round at the house, his grandparents and his uncles and nieces and nephews and everybody else, and they're having a big Thanksgiving dinner, and he said he just locked himself away in his room and obsessed into his art, his animations. He didn't even want to be around his own family at that important American holiday. So it seems that he has the qualities of a pretty good artist in a certain sense. He's very environmentally sensitive, he's very introspective, but not necessarily a good social animal, even with his own family, and this compulsion to return inwards as a flight from the world, which is perceived as being difficult or adversarial in some way, is very much rooted into our primal natures. It's actually a part of our survival mechanism, this way of dividing the world up into two parts between the world of the self and the world of the other. We could also speak about this as a process of dividing the world into a body of what we know and the body of what we don't know. And we call what we don't know the other. Now, under typical circumstances, this process is expressed prominently in divisions between ourselves and foreigners. Our people embody the known, a common language, shared history, common culture, etc. And the foreigner, whilst also possessing these things in his own right, represents an unknown variable and therefore is treated as other. So there's a line drawn between the self and the known and the other and the unknown, and the level of intensity by which that divide is experienced can predispose us to a highly fearful and aggressive stance towards the world. Now, I want to just quickly say that I don't agree with the general pathologization of this component of our nature by psychoanalysts. It's a very important aspect of our organism, and even though it can sometimes express itself in negative ways, it doesn't mean that we have to pathologize it in totality and treat it as a disease to be cured. I just wanted to put that out there. But taking this metric of self and other into consideration, what happens when you are the self and the world becomes the other? The human world demands interaction. It demands communication, conversation, compromise. It requires all of these highly interactive and engaged circumstances that we need to be in to make the whole operation work effectively. But in certain people, especially very sensitive kinds of people who express difficulties in social engagement, what occurs in them, and it turns the world into an adversary. The brain literally interprets every interaction with other human beings as if it were a predatory animal. That's a good way to think about it. I mean, social interaction for you might not be a big problem, but for some people, it's an agony. It's an agony. And there's a whole variation in between of how people operate in the social dimension, but for people like Randy Stair, this is more than just a matter of, sucking it up and have some confidence in yourself and, belt up. When you're born into a human social system as an asocial animal, it perturbs the very sense of being in the world, and it slowly rots and eats away at your self-confidence because you feel impotent in the world. And you are impotent in the world in a certain way, but this is something that we need to take into account here, because this mode of thinking about the world and relating to the world and being in the world are the substrates by which we metamorphose through life. And if your mind's way of interpreting the world is like an overbearing predatory cobra, yeah, then your existence is going to get really difficult really fast, and it's going to keep on getting more difficult until some measure is taken to remediate that. We are at the very bedrock of this analysis now. We're trying to get a grip of Randy's sense of operation before we plug deeper into the unconscious aspects of his psyche. And then further down the line, we're going to enter into an understanding of how he came to reconcile with his plights through his creative projects. So now we have a handle on Randy's background. We know that he was a social isolationist. We know that he had serious problems connecting with other people, including his own family members, and that from the way that he spoke about his relationship to existence, it correlates very strongly to a highly problematic perception between himself and the world as an adversary, as something that wanted to hurt him merely by existing. And it's apparent that he migrated into adolescence. When he migrated into adolescence, this process of anxiety and conflict with the world continued, and it grew worse. And this converted into a deep depression that would ultimately continue to rule his life up until he terminated his relationship with life itself. And most of this experience he had of his suffering was concealed away from his parents. He didn't really open up to them because, of course, why would he? When you interpret the very state of existence as a threat, why would you make yourself vulnerable and open up to anyone? Because when you open up, that's an avenue for more hurt to enter in. And so people in these conditions kind of tortoise shell and seal themselves away from the potentiality of being exposed to more of the agony that comes from human interaction. Let's just look at this small clip he has from his uploads.
I guess I should tell you when this started, because all throughout my life, I was never big on living. I hated life. I almost always did. I hated meeting people. You know that full well. I just hated going through everyday life. I always did. And I just always wanted to get away from it all. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to go to college. I didn't want to go to work. It wasn't me. It was never for me. But in this day and age, you need a degree. You need all that to get a fucking career and all that shit. But I knew full well that in a few years I'd be dead. There was no point.
So you can see this agonizing sensitivity towards life come through in the way that he talks about things. And it's easy to pass this kind of thing off as just a little bit of teen angst. But what does that even mean? These words like teen angst are throwaway statements in the culture that we can use to trivialize something so that we don't have to really think about it and look into it that deeply and actually understand what's going on beneath it. And it's exactly that kind of deliberate ignorance that we're trying to avoid here in this analysis. And here's another really interesting statement he made about his burgeoning fatalism, which we'll explore a lot more if this goes on, because as he develops further into the darkness of his depression, it amplifies this sense of predetermination around his life experiences, which is very important to his metamorphosis. And he was talking here for the first time when he started to contemplate his own death.
The depression started back up, like, as I said, like, you know, I hated my life, my whole life, pretty much. I hated being alive. And elementary school, middle school, things were okay. You know, I thought about death occasionally. I would picture, like, in my head, like, what is the afterlife like? Like, what do you do for eternity? You know, I wonder how old I'll live to be, or all this. And the one thing that always struck me was I could never see my future, ever. Like, you know, when you're growing up, you have, like, ambition and being like, oh, I can do this the rest of my life, or I want to be this and all that, which I had. But I was never able to see myself getting married. I was never able to see myself having kids. I was never able to see myself past my 20s, ever. And it just was one of those things where it's like, wow, I might not live very long. And it's like, I knew I wasn't going to live very long. And this one other girl who died, Rachel Scott, if you've ever heard of her name, Dad most likely knows from Columbine. She had the similar experience of being like, I can never see my future, and I feel like I'm going to die young, and that's just how it's meant to be and all that. And that's how I felt like my whole life. That's my destiny. I'm destined to be dead. Everyone alive is going to die someday, but I was destined to die from the beginning. I was destined to be a dead female ghost.
And so, yeah, this is really telling of a few things. One is that in an organism's mind that interprets existence as a threat to its own existence, it's not very difficult to understand why he found it difficult to envision a generative future for himself, yeah? And this plays into the whole fate thing that continues on through this episode. And one thing that Jungian analysts like to do is they like to study the etymology of words, because they consider the significant associations that old words bring to have a deeper meaning to the unconscious mind, and those meanings can sometimes subliminally permeate into the conscious mind, almost like a form of race memory or a recounting of old lives. And so when I was looking up the etymology for the word fate, it came up with some really interesting associations. So here we have the Latin fatum, yeah, which can be interpreted as something like a sentence from the gods, or like an oracle's prediction, which is divinely inspired. We also have the Greek theos phaeton, which means the same thing, a fate prescribed by the gods. And we also have this mythological connection to the three fates in Greek mythology. The three fates are Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, and they spin a yarn together which determines the patterns of life and the way that existence unfolds. So there's a very symbolic and mythic heritage behind this single word of fate, and as I said, fate is something that became very significant to Randy's mind as his depression worsened and deepened, and we'll see how that exactly manifests as he starts to invest deeper into his relationship with his art. So before we actually go on to see how Randy Stair attempted to alleviate his plight through his creative ventures, and how this attempt actually made matters a lot worse in the long run, actually, we've got to briefly say something about some Jungian references that are going to be useful in us going on. I'm basically going to talk about these things as if I was speaking to someone who had never heard about them before, because I think that there are definitely going to be a few people out there who are really intrigued by this kind of stuff but don't have a great handle on it. So for those of you who do understand terms like the unconscious and archetypes, this will simply be a bit of a refresher, or you'll just have to bear through it with this interval, because as we go further into Randy's development story, none of the things that I'm going to say later will make any sense if we don't have a good grasp on what they mean now. So I want to start by briefly going over what the unconscious is in Jungian analysis, because this wouldn't really be a fitting Jungian treatment of this case if we didn't cover something about the unconscious, to be quite honest. The unconscious is a theory in depth psychology that evolved beyond the template set by Freud, his subconscious. And Freud took that to mean that there is a hidden domain of psychic activity that is in operation beneath the level of our conscious activity, and that this domain basically acts as a repository for psychological material that the conscious mind finds problematic. And so the mind shuts this material, or represses it, to use the appropriate terminology, into a space where it cannot disrupt ordinary conscious activity greatly. However, this material can subliminally leak into our conscious life and influence our behavior, often in ways that create problems for us. And the process of coming to terms with that hidden material is one of the primary aims of psychoanalysis. And we now know through modern neuroscience that there is indeed a wealth of psychological processes beneath the level of conscious activity that we are completely unaware of. And in fact, most of our organic and psychological operation as a human is actually unconscious to us. But Carl Jung greatly expanded beyond Freud's view of this being a mere repression box for traumatic content. Jung thought that this field of life that Freud had uncovered was an entire domain of psychic activity in and of itself, which was just as vibrant and just as complex and significant, if not in more ways more significant, than the range of activity that we experience in our conscious life. The unconscious would not only contain converted material that had fallen away from our eyes, so to speak. Jung also believed that the unconscious might contain features of the psychological history of mankind within it. So we're dealing with a much wider and dynamic hypothesis than the one that Sigmund Freud came up with. But what I suppose is significant for what we're talking about here with Randy is it all goes back to this notion that there are aspects of our psychological life that populate our minds, and that these aspects can leak into our waking behavior in very subliminal ways through dreams, visions, fantasies, projections, moods, and various other expressions of life that we might interpret on face value of being completely ordinary, but behind them contains the influence of a hidden agent of our psyche that we haven't brought into full consciousness yet. And it's this aspect of the human psyche that we really need to bring into the forefront of our attention now as we look deeper into Randy's case, because there are some really interesting patterns in his emerging behavior that link in to this unconscious life. So let's proceed. So we've heard a bit about his troubled relationship to life, and this started to produce fantasies of death and suicide to emerge in his mind. And what I want to do now is explore this field further using what we've just said about the unconscious, and talk about another Jungian aspect called the shadow. So we already understand this concept of the unconscious being a field of psychic activity beneath our conscious ranges of appreciation, and that material from this region can subliminally express itself through our actions. And when we look at Randy's life, we see many patterns that correlate to certain aspects of Jungian theory, when feelings of anxiety, dark moods, aggression, self-loathing, bitterness, hopelessness, and such like can often be associated to a field of our psychic activity that Jung described as the shadow. Now, this is how I would describe the shadow to you, okay? As soon as we are born and we rise to a certain level of understanding in our intelligence, our culture immediately begins imprinting its values into us. And it does this through our social heads, our parents, teachers, media, the arts, etc. And that has a necessary utility in the sense that in order to make a society functional, you need as many people on the same fundamental program as everybody else in the societal matrix. Its ideas, ambitions, perspectives, shared language, cultural mythos, that kind of thing. And we need this to guide people within a certain common direction, a shared sense of directivity. You can't create a successful society from 10,000 Nietzschean existentialists. There needs to be a general agreement over the patterns that organize and determine the ranges of our human behavior. Otherwise, we simply can't function properly, and we begin to fragment. But at the same time as this process is shaping the developing consciousness, there are certain ideas, expressions, and behaviors that the culture wants us to reject. Things like aggression, rudeness, uncooperativeness, hostility, stealing, deception, dishonesty, or even how much honesty is acceptable in certain situations. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I was going somewhere with my mother on a train, and you know what children are like. They haven't really fully understood the social matrix yet. They haven't learned all of these laws and regulations of the human world. And my mother tells me that we were on this train carriage, and there were multiple people, other people than me and my mother in this train carriage. And there's this particularly large woman sitting over adjacent to us. And I turned over to my mother, and I said completely aloud and completely innocently and honestly, as a child would, "Mom, why is that woman so fat?" And so all of these kind of things, the things that the society wants to use to regulate our behavior, and the kind of things that the culture wants us to reject, it all gets included into the mixture as well. And what comes out of that is we learn to consciously or even unconsciously regulate our behaviors in conformity with what the culture expects of us. And that rejected material, which is a part of us, becomes embodied in a certain aspect of our psyche called the shadow. The human body gives off a shadow, and in the same way, the consciously acceptable material embodies the living form of our social action, and likewise, it casts a shadow. And in certain times of personal distress, this rejected material can express itself through moods, anxieties, fantasies, dreams, and the like. And this is all part of our psychological anatomy that demands attention so that we can learn from our dreams and projections and mitigate the negative aspects of our psychic anatomy and amplify the more generative aspects of it. And traditionally, this has been contained within the living traditions and religious systems, but due to the developments in the West, this is a big problem for us because we're not all psychoanalysts, and the rug has really been pulled from under us. Christianity is not as powerful as it was. We're not really bound to a living tradition as much as we used to be, and so the Western psyche is largely adrift and allowed to proliferate enthusiastically with varying consequences. So that's the way that I want to think about the shadow in Jungian terms, and I want to play you now some things that Randy said. I'm actually quite enjoying this analysis, actually. I'm really getting into it. This was a big project for me, so I hope it turns out well for you. I hope it's really interesting in the end. So, yeah, I just want you to hear this and compare it to what we've been saying.
You know, you see it done so often in movies. People documenting their will on tape and saying things like, if you're watching this, I'm dead. I'm sorry, you know. And honestly, I've envisioned this day coming for as long as 10 years. And I never thought it would come, but here it is. Tired. Tired of breathing. I'm tired of going to a dead-end job. I'm tired of putting all this effort into videos that aren't going anywhere. I'm tired of animating in general. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm tired of my body. I'm tired of food. Tired of everybody.
So this is interesting as well, because we already know that Randy had a very difficult time in the social world, and that produced a lot of resentment and contempt in him. But we also see that there's more to this, because even the very requirements of his wider civilizational systems were a problem for him as well. And that's a very negative space to be in for an individual, where the human, social, and wider systems are difficult to process and become perceived in the same way as antagonisms. You're really not living with a great attitude towards life, let alone a healthy psychological framework to relate to it. And like I said, this feeling of impotence in life and a rejection of the human world and all of its requirements contributes to a welling of this negative material within the shadow psyche, and it starts bleeding into the conscious life. He becomes more withdrawn, he became more isolated, even more self-conscious, even more antagonistic towards the world, both within and without. And the pollution of all of this negative material swamps the psyche and produces these fantasies of death and suicide. And due to his obsessive nature, Randy became morbidly preoccupied with death fantasies and began to really immerse himself with the imagery of death and suicide.
I thought about suicide in high school. That's when it really started entering my mind like a lot. And I just like started to grow like attached to like darker stuff, which it really took off later down the road. But in like early high school, it just wasn't really there too much. But the thing that really started to push it was like when I started doing bad on all my tests and got bad grades and had to get tutored and started to prepare for college and having no idea what I wanted to do. And I wanted to go to Grandma and Pop-Pop's house and get one of their handguns and shoot myself, or completely douse myself with gasoline and light a match and hopefully it would kill me, you know? And it was in 2010 when I really legit started to think about doing it, because I didn't want to go to college. I didn't want to get a job. I didn't want to live on anymore. I just didn't want to do it. Like something just broke. I don't even know. Like I just blew a fuse in my head. And from that point on, I was just fascinated by death. And I just kept going into this dark place. And I liked it. I wasn't afraid of it. I liked it. I enjoyed it. It felt natural to me.
So why does this happen? Why does prolonged psychological distress lead to the manufacture of death fantasies? Well, part of it has to do with the shadow and our cultural relationship to death. If we observe various human cultures across the world, we see that the way that they organize themselves to the death state changes. We in the West, I would say, have a very unhealthy attitude towards death. We have to deal with the loss of people around us, like everybody else, but socially, we either suppress it and we don't want to talk about it because it makes us too uncomfortable, or in art, in the culture, it's actually even worse, because we take this most significant and powerful aspect of our lives and we make a pornography out of it. So the relationship that we have towards death in the West as a culture is mostly very negative and immature. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about the various connotations around death, because that's a bloody video series in itself. But for here, I just want to go over this psychological reflex that we're perceiving in Randy and talk about why so many people exhibit these kind of death fantasies. And Carl Jung said that negative psychological material can often be seen as a revealing manifestation in the psyche's desire to heal itself, a way for the unconscious to communicate with the consciousness and reveal through representative imagery various aspects of our life that we need to deal with. And I for one very much align with Jung's perception on that. I think that the self and the mind and the body are always in a kind of communion with each other, and I see that the visionary life of the body as a companion, an aid to facilitate health. But because we're so materialistic and rationalistic, we don't see the body as a companion. We don't perceive it as a messenger. And so we have this very confused relationship with our psychological life, and we suffer greatly for it. Now, I want to read you this statement from a gentleman called Stanislav Grof, who was a Czech psychiatrist, so not a psychoanalyst, but he was very well read in Jung, and he was actually one of the first men to perform laboratory studies with LSD in the 1960s to study the altered states that they produced. And he had some really poignant things to say about death visions and altered states of consciousness that I think map over completely in what we're saying here with the shadow content and thoughts of suicide. So this is what Stanislav Grof said. Grof gave a dramatic, this is from this book, Grof gave a dramatic example of the failure to contain the processes internally. Their innovative work with psychospiritual crises led to the idea of a spiritual emergency. Such crises, they say, often occur in non-ordinary states of consciousness and in ordinary states of consciousness, and are typically described in spiritual literature as rough passages along the mystical path. According to Stanislav Grof, a symbolic confrontation with death is often a vital part of spiritual growth. To move into a new state of consciousness, an old way of living has to die. And he also said, there is the potential for a very tragic misunderstanding. This is really important. There is the potential for a very tragic misunderstanding in which the need for ego death is confused with the necessity to kill oneself. And so we see this in individuals who have consistently devalued and repress their feelings, and as a result strongly resist the archetypal unconscious because it was become so populated with painful expressions. And so the psyche produces new visionary life to present to the conscious ego what needs to be reconciled and remedied. And I was also reading a very interesting statement by a Jungian analyst called Lionel Corbett, and he said this, specifically about the shadow. A confrontation with the dark side of our personal unconscious contradicts our image of ourselves and is deeply disturbing. Our fear of the shadow nature at both the personal and archetypal levels is ultimately a fear of psychological death, that is, to develop psychologically. Our ideal image of ourselves must die as we recognize and integrate the shadow side of our nature and become whole. And he's talking here about moods as well. When I get angry at my neighbor's selfishness, for example, it could be that I'm projecting my own selfishness into him. So our perception of the other person is obscured by that part of ourselves that we see in the other person. The other becomes then the carrier of the darkness that we fail to acknowledge in ourselves. It is not the conscious subject, but the unconscious which does the projecting. Hence, one meets with projections, one does not make them. An individual projects his own darkness into the world at large, and has a vision that he must kill himself to escape and prove his worth to God. In the act of attempted suicide, he acts out his repressed anger and avoids coming to terms with his own shadow. Now, remember how Randy suffered through his social dysfunction and his existential angst, and how he alienated himself from the world? What was he doing? He was unconsciously projecting idealized fantasies of himself into movie characters, and he was thus further disassociating himself from the world and his own psychic nature. He didn't want to develop socially. He didn't want to develop in terms of his primary education and societal responsibilities, and he didn't want to face up to his shadow. And so the shadow faced up to him, and it made his life even more arduous. And so alienation, existential angst, obsession, and unconscious projection are all colluding here to produce an utter tempest of a man. And as we'll see, it only gets stronger from here on out. So now we're really getting into the good stuff. Now it's time to start talking about his creative life, because this plays an absolutely enormous part in his trajectory. But before I do that, let's just go over what we've understood so far. So we've assessed an understanding about Randy Stair's background and his agonizing sensitivity and vulnerability towards his existence. We've seen how this has started to produce visions of his self-extermination and a burgeoning fatalism in his thinking. And we've talked a bit about the underlying domain of unconscious activity that's going to be pervading through Randy's conscious life quite prominently from here on in. We now have to start studying Randy's specificity as a subject due to him being an artist, and in that he possesses the ability to extract out those psychic phenomena and codify them as an external impression in time. This ability is both a blessing and a curse in his story. We'll also see how these inventions as a product of his unconscious life were used to remediate some of his suffering and bring about a sense of missing love and connection to his life. But ultimately, those very same creations became weaponized against his own mind and became part of his fatalistic drive into hopelessness and destruction. And this is a big part of why I wanted to study Randy Stair as a case study, because I think he represents a very good example of how art can play into both the points of reconciliation and becoming also catalysts of an underlying burgeoning dysfunction. Randy, like all of us, was a product of his culture, and he, like everybody else, was locked in a very deep relationship with that culture. Culture is an extension, an organ of human civilization, but it also embodies an externalization of the conscious and unconscious dream life of a human group. And if we look at our culture today and all of its aspects, warts and all, we see that this is very much the case. This is where we get to a point in our story now where his troubled mind encounters a very important phenomenon that can be explained in Jungian terms, an aspect of his psyche that all men and women have and will continue to encounter throughout our lives. This is what is known as the anima in men and the animus in females. And this is the hypothesis that within every man, therein lies the reflection of a woman, and within every woman, therein lies the reflection of man. These are not to be taken literally in a biological sense, but in a psychoconceptual sense. They are the feminine and masculine countercomponent in each living psychology. And their names are derived from the root anima, which means to enliven, because Jung thought that they were the enlivening spirits to both men and women. And these, very much like the shadow, are products of the human unconscious life. The anima appears in dreams, in folklore, in world mythology, in literature, and most of all in the phenomena of human behavior. These are archetypes in the sense that they, again, like the shadow, compose the building blocks of the human psyche. And when they are expressed, even when they're expressed most powerfully, it is done so unconsciously. They are projected through our efforts very subliminally, and we often mistake their effects for the organic byproducts of our own autonomous action, even though their traces are to be seen all around us. When a man adores a woman from afar in a state of trance, his anima is active. And likewise, when he might scorn womankind as an enemy, the anima is also active within the shadow in tandem. We don't recognize this usually as a projection because we're so stuck in the moment and we're enthralled by its power. But if we're trained and we are conscientious enough to be able to recognize their patterns and their character when they arise, they can then become a mirror into our minds that can be reflected upon. But as I already said, most people are unaware that they are present, and therefore they are ignorant to their existence. And this is actually a major thing that initially drew me to this case, because as I found out more and more about the case and listened to Randy speak, it immediately spoke to the Jungian material. So we'll have a look now at some interesting clips of him and see how the anima in an already disturbed artist can contribute to the problem in various ways. So let's just continue with Randy's story then and see what he has to say about this one event that changed his life forever. He was a fan of a cartoon series on Nickelodeon called Danny Phantom. And there was one episode where a particular character caught his eye. And really listen to the language he uses, because this is the emblematic example of an anima projection.
I didn't want to live on anymore. I just didn't want to do it. And this is when the whole Ember thing started, which you may or may not know what I'm talking about yet. But if you watch my cartoons, I'm going to have to talk about a lot in this recording, by the way, because there's so much for me to cram into this thing that's like impossible. But I've told you about her before. Like if you look on the poster behind me, those were inspired by Ember McLean, which is a ghost from a TV show called Danny Phantom, which started back in 2003, 2004. You know, I was in late elementary school at that time. But this ghost, this woman always connected with me ever since I first saw her. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong camera. I have my phone on top of my camera. I keep forgetting I gotta look here. But ever since I first saw her, something changed. And it wasn't like I grew up or anything like that. Like I realized, oh my gosh, I'm attracted to girls and all this. No, it just, something changed. It was like a spark. And it just connected with me. It made me feel warm inside. And it felt very familiar, which was strange. It was like I'd seen her before. But at the time, it was a brand new show. And nothing had ever been done like that before with that type of character. Like, you never saw that character anywhere else except that show. And it's just something changed. And at the time, I was like 13 when I first started watching that show. And I just grew attached to her, unlike anything I ever have in my life. It was like my first crush, and it's a cartoon, you know? It's kind of crazy to think of it that way, but that's the truth. And whenever I like started feeling down and depressed, I thought of this character. Like in later high school is when she started to come back into my life. Like, you know, I watched Danny Phantom in middle school, late middle school, early high school, but then I kind of drifted away from it. And once 12th grade rolled around is when I started to get, you know, depressed and venture off into this darker area. And this girl was just there all the time when I got into that darker place. And the character's backstory was she died in a house fire, and she made this song called Remember. And it's a song that basically sums up her death. And I couldn't stop playing it. it like hypnotized me. And that's the irony of it all, is this ghost hypnotizes you with her music. And it just, it changed me. I can't even explain it. It was just, it hooked me, reeled me in, and she was always there when I got into this dark, depressing place. And I just connected with her unlike anything I ever have in my life. And that's when I started thinking about killing myself by burning myself. So I just remember, it was just something about how she looked. Like we all say, like, yeah, like we all kind of matured a little when we first saw her, but it was just, it just looked familiar. And at the time, Danny Phantom had been around for, a good 6 years. So I kind of remember vaguely seeing that character back in like 2006. But it felt like so much more at home for me now. It just seemed like so much more than just being familiar with her. And it's just very hard to explain. I just could not stop playing the track. I just played the living hell out of that song. And I just kept envisioning setting myself on fire. And in March was when I got into Ember, and then it just felt more than familiar. That's all I can say. I just kept looking at her, and it's like she got it. She understood me. I understood her. We had feelings for each other. And it was way more than just a simple connection. It was life-changing. And this is just a static 2D flattened image on a screen, And I went into a zone that I had never really been in before. Nothing seemed to matter. It was just like a magical dark place. And it was a dark place. It wasn't happy sunshine rainbow stuff. It was a dark and depressing place. And Ember I felt like I could trust her. I felt like we had known each other before. And I just felt like I could have been her in a way. Ember just all it took was one look at her. Just one look. Even if it was just a glance, it took one look. That's all it took.
So, yeah. Did you pick up on how he was talking about that cartoon character? You listen to the language he's using to describe this relationship with her when he says things like, it all felt so natural, and things like, this ghost, this woman, it always connected with me. It felt familiar. Yeah? I wonder why. It's because he's experiencing something of himself that feels right at home in his psyche, and he's unconsciously projecting it into the vision of this created character, which he's mistaking for an aspect of his own psyche, reaching out to him. This is an anima projection, if there ever is one. This is the quintessence of an anima projection. And remember the fact that the fact that she's a cartoon makes it even more profound, because cartoons aren't people. And cartoons don't come with the same complexities and consequences as dealing with other human beings, hence them being cartoons. But because they look like humans, the psyche can still relate to them as human, and it can begin projecting its contents into the stimulating image. It's hardly surprising that an individual like Randy Stair formed a relationship with a cartoon, because human beings need intimacy and they need connection, and if they can't find that from people because they're too dysfunctional, they'll find it in other areas, and escapist media is a banquet for needs like that. And the lyrics of the song that this character sang in this particular scene, I think, is also integral to this. this character called Ember, she's basically a ghost, and she's singing about her past life. So there's a few snippets that I thought that Randy Stair would have taken particular interest in, given his particularly morbid fascination. So here are a few of the lyrics. Your life goes on without me, my life a losing game. But you should not doubt me. You will remember my name. So the lyrics are about life being a losing game. I think that would have been very familiar to Randy, and the way that he felt about things, and those lyrics at the end especially about not taking him for granted and remembering him forever. I think that'll have much greater significance as this story unfolds. So after this event, he became obsessed with this character, and he eventually used his creative abilities to create his own versions of her, which were basically like Ember. They were ghosts. But these were ghosts combined with a new kind of material, a much darker, much more morbid material. They were people who had all died in horrific accidents, and this stems out of the year 2013, where a series of bad events happened in sequence to Randy in his life. He crashed his car, and then after his brother crashed his car, the water mains in his house blew, all of his recording equipment and his computer malfunctioned, and all of this happened sequentially. Now, to us, it might be like, oh, so what? First world problems, that kind of thing. But remember, he interpreted all of this as significant. He heavily concentrated as well on the number 13 in a very superstitious way. He thought that was instigating it all to happen. This number 13, it was making all of this happen, which married into his concerns of fate, that things were moving on this inevitable trajectory which can never be prevented. And most importantly, somebody who he knew died in a car accident that year, and that threw him even further into the realms of morbidity. He was like a monk meditating on death constantly, and especially his own death, which he considered to be attached to this trajectory of fate. So let's hear him again talk now more about his experiences with this Ember character and the cartoons that he was making.
If you look back, 2013 was when I got word that Matt died. It was January of 2013. 2 months after that, in March, was when I got into Ember and never got out of her. Ember just took over my life, and everything just seemed like destiny at the time. It's like, okay, I was the first person to upload this. I was like the first person to know about the song being found in HD. Things were really looking up, and it just felt like fate. I can't even explain it. I made a few more videos, and that eventually led to me going into animation and doing cartoons, and it's all thanks to that character, that Ember character. I just felt a connection to her. I felt like I've known her before, even though she's a cartoon. Spiritually, I just felt connected. It's like she just grabbed me and roped me in. I can't even explain it. And that's when I just got into the cartoons, and this is the biggest what if, but it goes back to fate and destiny. This was when I had the hand surgery done. I quit the hospital job and all this, and I got the hand surgery, which ultimately led to me going to night shift and all this, and then this happened, and it just happened. I can't explain it. It was just fate. Some people would be like, what a far-fetched concept that is. How the fuck do you come up with something like that, It's just, when I was in that dark and depressing place, that's what Ember led me to. It was I was meant to do this. It's as if the almighty powers above was saying, this is what you're supposed to do.
So here again, we see this pattern of fatalistic thinking emerge in his mind regarding the events of his life and his relationship to the projected anima construct. He is not in any kind of therapy. and he does not understand how to relate to these fantasies through any other proactive means from the outside. He simply relates to them in the same order that he's always related to things like this, through projection and through obsession. And so the projected content is not being interpreted as a bridge between his conscious mind and his unconscious that it truly is. He isn't treating this as a psychoanalyst would. He's treating this like an overly sensitive, introverted, obsessive adolescent would. And he's been carried by this projected material. He's been possessed by it to create more art, which in turn encourages and justifies more fantasies to emerge in his mind. And he's interpreting all of this in hindsight as a great act of fate. And Carl Jung addressed this very directly. He said, if you do not make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So, again, in a way, this unconscious material is being made manifest through the animations that Randy is creating, but due to the style of relationship that he has to the world, the undercurrent associations behind these creations is not being addressed, and it's contributing to an escalation of the situation. And so what we have here is this big chain reaction between unconscious projection leading into fantasy being codified through creative representation, and then subsequently that creative material has become the catalyst and justification for further obsession into these fantastic states. In other words, the art is actually making this worse. It's embodying his inner life as the line. It's embodying his inner life as the line between his ability to distinguish them from ordinary reality is being confused. There's a part of his mind that understands that they're cartoons, of course, but due to the consistent flooding of his conscious mind with this unreconciled content, the destabilizing effects of his depression are bringing into this as well, and his naturally obsessive and fatalistic way of reading into the world. His mind is treating these creations with a greater degree of vividness and alternative context than someone else would.
You know, pretty much since you're a kid, you think about things once in a while, not all the time, but you think from time to time, what is it like to die? You know, it's a question you ask yourself throughout your entire life. What is it like to die? And, you know, depending who you're surrounded by, you more likely than not will deal with a relative passing away, who's obviously most likely going to be anywhere between the ages of 50 and 80 plus, you know? So when I was a kid, I dealt with some deaths, but they were just with people who I didn't know much. You know, when I'm like 6 to 9 years old and, you know, a great aunt passes away, you know, it's like I didn't really know who they were. So it like wasn't really sad, but still I felt the feels, you know, from the funeral and the viewings and all that. But I didn't really see a dead body until middle school. It took that long. I would like to say it was 2005 was the first time I saw a dead corpse. And it just stuck with me. Just that the thought of just being gone, you know, you're not in this body anymore. Your soul's gone. I made a recording the other day talking about, it was like a week ago, talking about, you know, what I think the meaning of life is and saying everyone has a soul and all this. And, you know, you can listen to that. I won't repeat everything, but, you know, it's weird just thinking like that's just an empty body. There's no soul in it. There's no life in it. It's dead, you know, and it's like, where did they go? Where did the soul go? And, you know, people have their own beliefs on everything, and it's just, that's what it will be for you in the end. What you believe, what your faith is, that's where you're going to end up. You know, if you're a Christian, Catholic Christian, if you're Methodist, if you're Lutheran, if you're Muslim or something, I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. That's what your afterlife is going to be. So it's like your mind saying that this is where I was and these are who my leaders are on the other side. And I'm here to accomplish something. And I was sent here from them. I was assigned a contract saying this is what was going to be expected of me and this is what was going to happen and this is how I'm going to die. you won't get to see me anymore. And this will be one of the last visuals you'll have of me, you know? I don't post like my face on social media much anymore because this isn't who I am, you know? I'm Andrew Blaze. I'm not this here. I'm that. I'm not this, you know? I can't emphasize that enough. And over the last few years, I just hated looking at myself. And it's because it's not me. EGS, it's so much more than just a cartoon. It's not a cartoon. It's life. And it's what the afterlife is for some people like myself. Just, there was never a girl on earth who was like, that. I'd love to screw her. I'd love to date her. I'd love to kiss her. Like, I never had that. Never went on a date, you know. It's just, I never had that. With the cartoons, I did. It's like, yeah, they're just flat, dimensional, paper-like images. What do you see in that? I see a whole other world.
In a certain way, he is looking at them in a Jungian sense because he's relating to them as true aspects of his being, his psyche. But he's not reading into them as messengers of something that he needs to work on within himself in a positive way. He's taking them and constructing them into a new fantasy dimension, which he calls this ghost squad, which is, as I said, this afterlife where these created constructions live for eternity and they return to haunt the world, which, yeah, is what archetypes do. But that new dimension is then rationalized by him as a point of destination, a kind of afterlife to gravitate towards, to escape the agony of his own existence. He's world building here. He's myth making. He's performing the same styles of creative action that many others have made before him. Shamans, mystics, visionaries of all kinds of description, and an artist is the closest thing that you will ever get to that in the Western world. But as the quote from Carl Jung said that I put up at the very beginning of this video, art emerges from the same bedrock of psychic life that a psychosis emerges from. But that doesn't mean that we should interpret all art as a psychosis. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying that the body is an engine of energetic psychic life, and this visionary life springs from the same grounds as a psychological disorder. So as he continued to create this world and has his mind continued to spiral into these visions of darkness and disorder, he initially started reaching out to this anima figure, this ember, for respite, a kind of a spiritual connection to another soul that he couldn't get from real life. And he became completely normalized to that pattern of behavior. It wasn't peculiar to him at all in the end. And you see this in it if you watch some of his final videos, if you care to find them, how well composed he is to everything, to everything he's doing, how he's completely internalized this romantic figure, this world, this ghost squad afterlife, and his inevitable death as a given thing. It's a concrete part of his reality now. And this is both interesting and very disturbing to us because it's saying how creative codifications of psychic material can help with the integration process. But in this case with Randy, due to the influence of his shadow and the absolutely morbid and hopeless state of existence that he's in, that restoration eventually crystallizes into a dark vision of personal destiny. I think it's also worth briefly saying something about his transsexual development as well. Randy accounted for the fact that when his parents were out, he started wearing his mother's clothes in secret. At the same time, he was obsessing into this character of Ember, and he started to conceive of himself as possessing a female identity, as opposed to his ordinary biological identity. Now, I can't find anything to indicate that he was an SJW, and another thing that he emphatically stated, that he wasn't gay. it would be rather difficult to be gay and have a female soulmate who was also a cartoon. But anyway, regardless, he possessed a lot of the trait characteristics of that we see sometimes in SJW behavior. His hatred of masculinity, his hatred of anything to do with men in general, his contempt for masculinity, which also contributed towards his own self-loathing, of course, as a male. And he brought into the whole... He really bought into the whole social constructivist perspective of gender, and he used this as a catalyst to further his own metamorphosis down the line, even creating a female cartoon alter ego of himself to exist with his created anima projection in the Ghost Squad afterlife for all eternity. Referring to his perspective and the events of the murder, he wrote, "I was just a female soul trapped in a man's body my whole life. The girl in me is clawing to get out. 62 more hours." Now, I want to keep this focused on Randy Stair and not go off on too many tangents, but since this is associated to the life work of Carl Jung, I just quickly wanted to say that it is a crying disservice to everything that he committed to mankind to have his ideas on archetypes mistreated in such a way by the social constructivists and weaponized against the psyche of young people in such a way as well. The modern education system is taking people at a very sensitive period in their lives where their identity structure is very fragile, and they are introducing them to highly corrosive and deconstructive philosophical ideas and hijacking the positive work that's been committed to the humanities over the years and using that as a weapon against the burgeoning mind. And they are churning out legion after legion of psychological chimeras, and to the detriment of those young people and their own organic development. But anyway, we're getting near to the end of this now, so let's cover what we've said so far. Here we have an individual that could not commit to life's demands, who interpreted existence as an adversary and fell into his own quagmire of morbid fantasy. The destabilizing effects of his depression opened up the reservoirs of the unconscious mind to flood into his conscious life, generating very powerful projections which were projected into external subjects that corresponded to the disturbances in his psychic world. These visions then became codified into a personal mythology of longing, of connection, of death, and fatalistic destiny, ultimately leading to the events that sealed the fate of Randy Stair and 3 other souls. On June the 8th, Randy Stair took 2 shotguns to a nearby supermarket, which was also his place of employment, barricaded the entrances, and shot 3 of his co-workers before finally turning the gun on himself. He left behind 2 parents, a sibling, and a mass of video contents that detail his life from a young boy leading all the way up to the final video he released saying goodbye to his parents for the final time. In one of his last videos, he said, "I'm so ready to die. I've officially accepted that Wednesday night will be the death of me. Everything around me seems to have faded away, and it feels as though I'm the last soul alive on this planet for the last week. I see people, but they feel like an illusion. I've never felt so distant from society, and I love it." Oh man, this has been a long video. This video has taken me about 4 days to make, to research and everything, so I hope that it's been insightful, and I trust that you've taken something from it with regards to the Jungian references. Just before I close this all down, I just want to say a few things in closing about my personal thoughts on cases like this, and about what I think that it tells us about our society in general. We radically underestimate the psychological significance of the world that we have inherited. This world is without ligament and without a father, and we are destroying ligaments as fast as we can, and we're spitting in the image of the father, and we've made Liliths out of Eves, and we have an abusive relationship to the truth. And all of this is done in the name of equality and freedom and comfort and convenience. We are the most rootless people on this earth. And people like Nietzsche warned us about this. People like Jung tried to remedy this. All the great religions and all of the great sages and philosophers have been trying to remind mankind of their roots and of their organic heritage as the most sophisticated system in all of nature. And we in the West, we have created such an incredible world of plenty for ourselves. But have we created a society that gives the human soul what it desires? Have we attended to the psyche? To logos? No. We spit on these things every day. We sever ourselves from these things every day. And like I said, one day soon, we are going to face the consequences of our ignorance. The shadow is making itself known more and more in our world, and it's not going to slow down. And when you look at cases like Randy Stair, you can call these things isolated cases, but man, mark my words, these are anything but isolated cases. Because what he represents, his story, his journey that took him to where he got, that's the secret story in the hearts of thousands of young people all over the Western world. There are seething, secret cauldrons of loneliness and malcontentedness brewing in every city and every community and likely every street in the West today. And one day, one way or another, all of that material is going to come out. Because it has to come out. Whether a person wants it to or not. You can't rationalize these things away. You can't smother them with platitudes and sentiments about being a good person forever. These things demand reconciliation, and we fail ourselves not to treat them with the seriousness that they deserve and the great opportunity that they present. And I'm not saying that all of these people out there are going to end up exactly like him and commit the same kind of regressions that he did. I'm not. But what I'm saying is the possibilities for destruction are there. And destruction and suffering can express themselves in all kinds of ways. The capacity for human beings to create suffering is proportional to their own relationship with suffering. And human beings can articulate new ways of bringing suffering into the world very readily. And they can do so because the underlying substrate that facilitates these breeds of action into the world are inside all of us. They're in you, they're in me, they're in everybody. Don't let that distinction between the self and the other fool you into thinking that you're totally different than an agent of suffering like Randy Stair. because you can make people suffer, and you likely will make people suffer in your life. I've made a lot of people suffer greatly, and it is a responsibility of mine to observe that, to understand that, to learn from that, so that I can mitigate my capacity for suffering and maximize my potential for generative action. And you can say that that's an admirable thing, but that doesn't remove that doesn't remove from the fact 1 inch that I don't have a shadow, and that I don't have the capacity for a burgeoning darkness in me. It's there, and it's always going to be there. You can't destroy it. You can't remove it. You can't rationalize it away. You can only convert it. You can only transform it. And in the process of doing that, you avoid becoming an agent of suffering, because you've learned from the suffering inside yourself, and you've transformed its chaos into an order, into a path, into a logos, a truth. You can't defeat the unconscious with reason. You can only pay attention to its signals and learn from it like your system wants you to. You can either listen to it and learn from it and use that evidence as the seeds of a new trajectory in your life, or you can ignore it and face the consequences of your ignorance. The elixir is drawn from the poison. That's how it works. Because here's the thing, it's stronger than you. You might think that you're a big tough guy and that you work out, or you've read all of these great books and you're on the way to glory. And those are good things because they build you up. But there's an arrogance that comes with growth, and that there's an overconfidence that stems from success. And arrogance is a slippery customer because it gets the better of you very easily. And it makes you unconsciously project all kinds of fantasies about what you think you are and how good you're going to have it in the future. And if you overestimate yourself, you fail. Because before, if you'd listened and you'd been conscientious to the signals within your system that it was sending to you, warts and all, I guarantee you, you'll be in a better position than you are now. You were made to listen to your mind. It's talking to you. It wants you to listen. Don't ignore the signals that come to you from your depths. Your system is doing that because it wants to work with you. It's part of the human organism's maintenance approach, and it's taken us years to come to terms with that. And we're still doing a complicated and troublesome job of trying to get to grips with that we're trying to figure it all out. So don't dismiss these things when they come to you. They're there to help you, even when they're dark. Especially when they're dark. So don't give in to the ultimate illusion that we're good enough as we are, because we're not. We're always trying to grow, and we're always trying to move in a certain direction. And the entire problem for Western people is to find their direction, their true direction, their organic direction. Because otherwise, we're going to flounder in what Jung called the neurosis of meaninglessness. This guy, who we've been talking about, he was one of the fallen. He was moving in a certain direction, and at one point in it, it almost seemed like he was beginning to find his logos. He was beginning to find his order. He was beginning to find his truth. But it became strangulated by his limitations, and whenever people tried to help him or give him advice, he shut them out. And when his life was sending him the signals, he didn't deal with that responsibly. He only converted that into the catalysts of his own demise, using the very creative agency that could have lifted him out from it if he had listened, if he'd tried. And I don't think he ever tried. I don't think that he ever wanted to try. Art's a bloody dangerous game. It can make you or it can suck you in. It can suck you right in. Because that's the imagery of your life. That's the imagery of your soul. And when you draw that out as a crystallization, a codification of what's been inside, you vivify that within your mind's contents. And it can be so instrumental as an aid in your own psychological development, in your own mental health. So that's what all I wanted to say. I know it's been a long video. If you've been with this to the end, then I congratulate you. I really hope that you found this very interesting. I look forward to any comments that you might include down in the comments section below. I'm pretty tired now after making this. Like I said, this has been like a 4-day project that I've been working on. So I hope it's been instructive to you, and I hope that you take away something positive from it, and you pick up a bit of Jung, or you start listening to some of the things that your mind is trying to tell you, because we cannot go down the same paths as these people. So yeah, I'm going to end it now. It's been a long one. Thank you very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.